Welcome to the week 5 of Certificate Course in Dialogue Studies 2022-2023 cohort. We are very stoked to have Professor Ori Z Soltes with us. Professor Ori is a professor at the Center for Jewish Civilization, Georgetown University, Washington, D.C. He teaches across a range of disciplines. As co-founding director of the Holocaust Art Restitution Project, he has spent 20 years focused on the issue of Nazi-plundered art. Professor Soltes has authored and edited 25 books and scores of articles and exhibition catalog essays. Recent volumes include Our Sacred Signs, How Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Art Draws from the Same Source, Growing Up Jewish in India, Synagogues, Customs, and Ceremonies, from the Bene Israel to the Art of Siona Benjamin, Mysticism in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Searching for Oneness, Tradition and Transformation, 3 Millennia of Jewish Art and Architecture, Magic and Religion in the Greco-Roman World, the Beginnings of Judaism and Christianity, and God and the Goalposts, a brief history of sports, religion, politics, war, and art. Thank you so much, Professor Soltes, for joining us. I'm sure all our participants are quite eager to listen to you, and there will be a lot of new things they will learn from you. So I hand over the session to you. It's all yours now, and you can conduct it whichever way you like. And we'll have a question answer at the end of the session as usual. Thank you, Professor.
And how long do you want the whole session to go? I forgot to ask.
The entire time, including the question and answer, is 2 hours. And you can maybe break it down into 2 parts, your session and the question answer.
Fine. Okay. Thank you so much. So I was asked to talk about the book that finally came out. There was a paper shortage, so it was about a year delayed, called Between Thought and Action, an Intellectual Biography of Fethullah Gulen, and why I wrote it, and what it's about, and of course, what he is about. So I'll start with I don't know which is the simple answer. Why I wrote this book. I have been interested and involved in different ways in the movement that Gulen has inspired, called Hizmet, which in Turkish means service, the Hizmet movement. I guess probably by now about 10 or 11 years, I'm not sure, I kind of lost track. And I earlier wrote a small book on his thought and its relationship to a number of different thinkers, but in particular to Sufi mystics and other mystics, and in particular to the mystic Rumi. And I guess 6 years ago, in the summer of 2016, I became incensed by what was being consistently referred to as a failed coup that July. You're no doubt familiar with it, that the Turkish media, by then entirely under the thumb and in control of one individual, Erdogan, had promoted internationally as a coup that had been attempted by followers of Fethullah Gulen and that had been stifled and failed. And immediately at that point, just on the information that was available at that moment, I thought, this is not a failed coup. In Turkey, they do coups about every 10 years. They know how to do coups. This was not done the way a coup is done. You don't do a coup in the middle of the day. You do it in the middle of the night. You round up the people you need to put out of action. You don't leave them free to take counteraction. You don't do it in the middle of rush hour. Mr. Erdogan was there with amazing speed on the spot and already had a list of all of the alleged perpetrators of the coup, who could therefore then immediately be rounded up, thrown into prison, tortured, and so on. He was recorded in a conversation by the British with one of his associates saying, look, I don't care about any details just as long as Gulen and the Hizmet people get blamed. So it was clearly not a false, it was clearly not a failed coup. It was a false coup. It was a fake coup. It was a coup that Erdogan initiated in order to find an opportunity in the eyes of Turks and the world at large to accuse Hizmet and round up his remaining Hizmet enemies, or anyone he perceived to be an enemy, anyone he perceived to be against him. And I was reminded of what happened in the early 1930s in Hitler's Germany, when his own people set fire to this important building in Berlin, the Reichstag, and then were able to blame it on the communists, who were his key political opponents at that time, and round them all up. So in many ways, Erdogan resembles Mr. Hitler, but that's not the point. The point is that this event very closely resembled that event. And I was incensed at how the world press, certainly the American press, but elsewhere as well, was so spectacularly uninformed, unnuanced, unaware of what was going on in Turkey. So they simply accepted the story as it was being promoted by Erdogan and Erdogan's government. This idea was reinforced for me not too long thereafter, when my best friend handed over to me a long article in what is considered a very fine, very kind of popular but intellectual but popular magazine in the United States, The New Yorker. You may or may not be familiar with it. And its journalists are highly regarded. And there is a long portrait, a long article about Gulen. And the journalist who wrote it, respected journalist, had clearly not done his homework with respect to trying to get different sides of the story. He'd clearly been informed exclusively by the Turkish media, as that media was constituted under Erdogan, in which case its intentions vis-a-vis Gulen were nothing but negative. And so what he presented to a fairly wide audience was a fairly negative image of Fethullah Gulen. So the combination of these two events impelled me to want to write a larger book about Gulen. It's called Between Thought and Action because of two things. One, it reflects both on his thinking and on his actions, but also because his thinking is intended to inspire action. And the movement that he inspired, called the Hizmet movement, is one in which we don't sit around, one doesn't sit around and philosophize, one doesn't sit around and theorize, one actually is out there. Members of the Hizmet movement all over the world, in 180 countries, are engaged in trying to improve the world, engaging with others, building schools, building hospitals, operating out of what Gulen promotes as an altruistic attitude, a sense of selflessness, a sense of concern for others that manifests itself, to repeat, in a range of different actions. So it's not just, as we say, as we Americans say, it's not just talking the talk, it's walking the walk. So the desire to do such a book also came in conversation with one of my friends and colleagues who is involved very much in the Hizmet movement. His name is Emre Celik, and Emre is originally from Australia, of Turkish extraction. So he's bilingual, but we always make fun of him because he speaks Turkish with an Australian accent. Mind you, my Turkish is very poor, so I can't really tell, but I know from his Turkish friends that they say that. So I try and pretend I'm one of them by making fun of his accent. Anyway, Emre was the one who suggested that I might include interviews as an important part of this book. So I will get back to that in just a moment. The basis for it, simply and straightforwardly, are his thought, Gulen's thought, his actions as reflected in his writings. So again, I've read much of what he has written and observed how over the course of the last 50 years or so, his thought has evolved, his thought has developed. It has continued to become more universalistic, and his obsessive, passionate focus on dialogue has, if anything, if it's possible, increased over time, as opposed to always been the same or what have you. So his thought, his action, his thought and his action as an inspiration for the thoughts and actions of others. So as I've just mentioned, not just the idea of studying the Quran carefully or studying the writings of Sayyid Nursi carefully, who is an inspiration for him from the early 20th century, but also going out and doing things, building schools, building hospitals, creating social networks, creating dialogue programs that range from iftar dinners that take place, speaking from where I'm from in Washington, D.C., all across the city, all across Ramadan, all across that entire month, there are iftar dinners that are emphatically interfaith and intercultural and interethnic and international and interracial, intergenderal. All kinds of people are invited to and join in these iftar dinners that are really just about celebrating, not just from a Muslim perspective, what iftar is in the context of Ramadan, the shifting from the mode of fast to the mode of eating and discoursing and discussing, but also how that's part of a larger human phenomenon, what we are as a species that engages many of us from many traditions under different circumstances in fasts, certainly in gatherings, in celebrations, and certainly celebrations and gatherings with food that come on the heels of a fast, that sort of action, programs that involve youth, performance programs, all sorts of activities are part and parcel of what the Hizmet movement, inspired by Gulen's teachings and preachings, is about. I have visited Hizmet-run schools, and in one case, in Tbilisi, Georgia, the International Black Sea University was founded by Hizmet, and many of its principals in terms of its administration and its teaching staff are Turkish, are from the Hizmet movement. Many of them are indigenous to Georgia, they're Georgian. And I have, except for the interruption of COVID, gone there to teach an intense course on the American novel for a week every summer for the last 6 or 7 summers. So I'm very familiar with that school, but I've also visited schools in the United States, in Australia, and in Georgia, and different cities in the United States, different cities in Australia, Tbilisi, Georgia, that offer a curriculum from elementary school to the end of high school. And the two most interesting features of that curriculum, particularly given the assumptions that people who don't know about Hizmet make about it, who don't know about Gulen make about him, what is interesting is the complete range of subject matter that is offered for students that goes from the obvious, math, science, literature, language, and that sort of material, to art and to sports, because the whole idea is to educate the whole person from all angles in all aspects. And I've been very impressed. In fact, my last visit to Tbilisi, at the elementary through high school there, I was extremely impressed with the artwork, for example, or with the projects that the 7th graders were working on in biology at such a high level. And by the way, which they were able to explain rather effectively in English, because English is a key language that is always in play across the world of Hizmet, whatever other languages and whatever myriad places in which these schools are founded. The second thing that I found interesting, given the accusations against Hizmet and Gulen, is that the one subject that isn't being taught in those schools is religion. Islam is not being taught in those schools. So these students in those schools come from a range of different faith traditions. And in some cases, depending upon where the school is, there are immigrant students as well as indigenous students. So you also have a range of ethnicities and nationalities represented. There's absolutely no emphasis on religion or on Islam specifically within what you could imagine might be an emphasis on Islam or on religion. So that while many of the students are Muslim, many of them are not. And I have known students from those schools whom I got to know in other contexts. A good friend who's actually from Albania, who grew up in a very, very secular Muslim family. I don't think his parents know how to spell the word Muslim, even in their own language. They're so secular. And he went to Hizmet schools in Albania, and he was so inspired by his teachers and the way they conducted their lives. And they conducted their lives informed and inspired by a very quiet but distinct and sincere piety as Muslims. And when I say distinct, sincere, and quiet, I mean you wouldn't know to look at them, to listen to them, to watch them, that there was anything particular about their Muslim piety, except for the fact that, oh, excuse me, I've just got to take 10 minutes to go pray now because it's prayer time. So you're aware of the fact that they're praying 5 times a day. You're aware of the fact if Ramadan happens to occur during the school year, you might not even be aware because they might not say anything, but you might notice that how come all this week my teacher hasn't been eating his lunch? Because it's Ramadan. So he's going through his whole workday, but he's fasting from sunrise to sunset throughout the entire month. Those kinds of things one might notice, but the teachers themselves would not call attention to themselves by even mentioning these things. And so this friend of mine was inspired to become a much more observant Muslim than he had been before. So one might find that, but there's nothing like the teaching of Islam, the pressure to become absorbed in Islam, the teaching of religion at all. My favorite story about what these schools are really about is the story that I learned when I visited a school in in Sydney, Australia. And the seniors, the high school seniors and juniors, introduced me to a project that they were working on. They had created an organic garden because the school had enough property to promote such a thing, because organic vegetables in that neighborhood are really difficult to get to find. So they produced successfully the garden, and as a consequence, they're responsible for it. A little bit of guidance from their teachers, but they're responsible, which means they've got to come to understand how food is produced. You know, you go to the grocery store, you pay your money and you take your food home. How did it get there in the first place? So they become involved, interested, and aware of the entire process, from planting to sowing and the vagaries of weather, the problems of not enough rain, too much rain, too cold, too hot. All of those things they become aware of and sensitive to, and they have a new understanding and respect of the vast farming community across the planet, whose lives are constantly dependent upon these kinds of issues. Then the products they sold locally to the neighbors around the area of the school, who were grateful to have organic vegetables, but the funds that they generated from the sales, they chose and found a particular project. It was in a small community in Africa that had difficult access to water. So they provided the funds that made it possible to dig a new well and produce a new water system for that community. So the outcome of their efforts was not just their awareness of the whole phenomenon of farming and the relationship with their immediate neighbors, but the profits from it went to assist in a community half a world away that had a particular need that they identified as something that they could help with, and establish both the relationship with that community and Hizmet service on behalf of that community. So really what the schools are about is not just math and science and language and art and sports, but it's about Hizmet. It's about service for the community and for the world around. So my impulse to write was inspired by the thoughts, the actions of Gulen, and the thoughts and actions that his thoughts and actions have inspired in others. When I wrote my first book on him, I had not yet actually met him. And I felt for the purpose of that book that I really didn't need to, because I was mainly focused on his thinking, and that was available to me by way of reading. But I did subsequently meet him. And I have to say the experience was an extraordinary one. You may be familiar with, either directly or because you've seen or heard or read about such things, you know, you have someone you admire greatly from a distance, a sports star, a movie star, some famous novelist, something of that ilk. And then you meet that individual through some circumstance, and you're really disappointed because the person turns out really not to be a nice person, or not to be anything like you thought because of the persona that was public in the media for the sporting, for the sport hero, or for the movie star, or for whomever it is. So when I met Gulen, here's someone I've admired from afar, and my response was exactly the opposite. I was not underwhelmed, I was overwhelmed by him. I was even more impressed than I had been by his writing. And what is it that impressed me? It's difficult to articulate. His sense of genuine as opposed to fake humility, because in my life I've known plenty of people who are fakely humble. Oh, I'm just so humble, and all of it is all about my ego, but oh, I'm so humble. His humility was so genuine, it seeped out of him. His warmth, we embraced when we first met. It was just instinctive. And his genuine interest and concern, not for himself, but for others. His questions always about others. I had the privilege of sitting in on one of his sohbets, you know, his discussions, his teaching sessions, and to observe how he responded to the students sitting at his feet. Everything about him impressed me. And when I went back to visit him, probably maybe 6 months later, and you understand this is someone whom people are visiting all the time, every day, loads of people. So I had no expectation that he would even remember having met me. It hadn't been that long a meeting. I'd also been with a second associate who was much older than I, and whom therefore, in deference, I allowed to do most of the asking and the talking. So it's not even as if that on that first occasion, Gulen and I had an intimate kind of one-on-one. We were in the large area where prayers are conducted, waiting to begin. It was actually evening prayers. And Gulen walked in the door, and he saw me halfway across the room, and he came directly toward me, to me, and we hugged again. So I was also, obviously I was flattered, but that's not the point. I was impressed that he would have remembered from so long ago this one individual, that his interest in people is such that he would have that kind of memory of a particular individual whom he had not met for that long and a while back. So all of this forms part of the nexus of my interest in producing this volume. And as I said at the outset, one of the things that distinguishes it, because there are a number of very fine biographies of Fethullah Gulen that talk about his teaching and talk about Hizmet and talk about his biography in much more detail than I got into. I offer a biography almost as a kind of preliminary, just so that the reader who may not be familiar with Gulen has a sense of where he comes from. Because, for example, his piety is not accidental. He comes from a very traditional, pious family. His mother, his father, his grandfather, his grandmother on both sides, and so on. He was unique among his parents' children, in that when the time for marriage arrived, and his parents very much wanted him to get married, he had already begun to develop this whole idea of teaching students from all over Turkey, particularly those who are underserved, underprivileged, those who come from Anatolia, who have less access to all kinds of things than, let's say, those in Istanbul or Izmir might, and educating them, helping them understand not the political side of Islam, but the civil side of Islam, and that as its importance, Islam as a form of faith that seeks to engender a concern for humanity and not a concern for political power. This is one of the things that emphatically distinguishes Gulen, for example, from Erdogan, but from many other of the Muslim leaders on the planet today who think in political power terms. And that's not where he is. That's one of the great ironies. Erdogan's pretense that Gulen offers a kind of counter state, some kind of counter political power to him, could not be further from the truth. That's not his interest. He's never been interested in running for political office. He has supported political candidates who he believes are promoting appropriate policies. And in fact, again, contrary to popular belief, he and Erdogan were never close friends. And then Erdogan turned against him. He supported Erdogan politically initially because Erdogan seemed to be pushing Turkey in the right direction, improving its quality of democracy. And as it turns out, Erdogan's view is that, and I'm quoting Erdogan himself, that democracy is like a train. At a certain point, you have to get off. And clearly he's gotten off the train, and the train has left the station, and he's in a very different place from the place of democracy. But Gulen's inclinations and his interests are in the civics of being Muslim, your involvement in the social and cultural framework of the community and the world around you, and not in political power. So my interest in expressing and exploring this biographically is just sort of the preliminary part of this volume. Much more of it is then devoted to his writings and his thought, and to the concept of hizmet, the concept of service, the concept of altruism, those kinds of concepts. And then probably half the book, based on the idea that, as I mentioned, Emre Celik had, and this is what makes this book different from others, is on interviews. So I interviewed about 80 people. And the point of this exercise is twofold, really. One, of course, is to present a critical mass of individuals who one way or another have some connection to hizmet, and to demonstrate how wide the variety of kinds of people who have that connection are. And two, by nature of the questions that I asked them, to find out really what is going on in their minds vis-a-vis Gulen and vis-a-vis hizmet. And it is symptomatic of the whole danger to anyone involved with hizmet that Mr. Erdogan poses. You may be aware, and this individual, as far as I know, is not even involved in hizmet, but there is a Turkish journalist who just the day before yesterday, or maybe it was yesterday, living in Sweden, received new threats from Erdogan and Erdogan's government saying, we're going to get you. And this guy has had to move his residence in order to be safe, but apparently they located his residence. They're publishing it with the idea that someone is either going to assault him or assault members of his family, because he wrote in his open-minded journalism about Erdogan and what Erdogan was doing and has done, of course, to Turkish democracy. He's demolished it. He's taken complete control of every branch of government, including the judiciary. So there's no such thing as justice in Turkey anymore. There's only Erdogan's law. He controls the legislature. He controls the executive branch, obviously. No such thing as term limits, which are in the Turkish constitution, exist any longer. So he has been an enormously damaging creature to the country in terms of its social fabric, in terms of its political fabric. He's also damaged it ultimately in terms of its relationship to the world. And this journalist has written about this. And so now, of course, he's one of many who are under threat. There are more journalists, by the way, in prison in Turkey per capita than any country in the world, including China, including the United States. I guess we don't claim to have journalists in prison. We probably have a few, including Name Your Country. So the nature of the interviews was to give a sense of what a wide range of different kinds of people have thought about Mr. Gulen. So first of all, there was a number of interviewees whom in the end I had to exclude because they were so concerned between the time when I interviewed them and the time when this book was poised for publication that they would be in danger, at risk, if their names were in such a publication. So I proposed to the editor, I said, why don't we ask if they'd be willing to have us use, what do you call it? You know, false names, pseudonyms. So the real names are not in use. So most of them said, yes, that would be okay. But there was a small group that was even scared to use a pseudonym, which is symptomatic of the situation that is part of what the negative side of what promoted this book, that promoted the idea of creating this book. The positive side is Gulen, the negative side is Erdogan. It's kind of these two sides. And second of all, the range of kinds of individuals that I interviewed were from his innermost circle to people who are much more peripherally connected to Hizmet. For example, a guy on Long Island who is the leader of the Jain community there, and also interested in interfaith dialogue and the like, had become involved with Hizmet in organizing events that involve both the Turkish community, which in that part of Long Island is well represented, and the Jain community, and then it expanded to involve others. So from the innermost circle, his personal physician, who's known him since elementary school, and a few others who have known him that long, to people who have just recently become involved or acquainted or aware of him. Turks, non-Turks, Muslims, non-Muslims, people who are as old as he in his early 80s, people who are as young as their teenage years, and everywhere in between. People who recently became aware of Hizmet and of Gulen, people who grew up in families where their parents, and even in a few cases, their grandparents, were already engaged and involved in the Hizmet movement. And I posed to all of these individuals essentially 2-3 questions. That's it. The first question, of course, well, where are you from? And that sort of thing. But the first real question was, how did you become aware of Gulen or of Hizmet? And how did you become involved with Hizmet? And in what capacity and what degree are you involved? And what is it that impresses you about Gulen? What is it that you would criticize, either about Gulen or about the Hizmet movement? What is it you would change if you could? And there was a remarkable degree of consistency in the responses. Again and again and again, the kind of answers I got were, what it inspires me about him is his vision. What inspires me about him is his universalistic thinking. What inspires me about him is his concern for others, his humility, all those things. And again, from different kinds of people, from, as I said, different walks of life, different cultures, different religions, different nationalities. These interviews were conducted in 4 languages. So some of my interviewees spoke English with me. Some of them spoke French with me. Some of them spoke German with me because they are located in different countries. And some of them spoke Turkish. And in that case, I needed some assistance. Emre Celik actually was with me during those interviews, and he interpreted it for me because my Turkish just is not good enough. And he also recorded all of them. And then there was a bevy of individuals whom I acknowledged in the beginning of the book who actually transcribed all of those interviews. 5 countries. So the interviews were in Australia, were in the United States, were in France, Germany, and in Georgia. I think that's right, yeah. And as I said, the responses were remarkably consistent. I want to read to you a part of one response. And I have to say one other thing. And I thank Hakan Yeshilova, my editor, for this suggestion. The original manuscript, in the original manuscript, I kind of just left the interviews very rough as they had been, so that the reader would actually read them as they were spoken. But in many cases, you know, when you're speaking and you're kind of informal and you do this mistake and you do or you don't correct yourself, he said, but it'll work better if you edited them. So I did edit them for syntax and grammar and things of that sort, and to make them more consistent. But here, almost arbitrarily, is one. And as I said, I grouped them into different kinds of individuals. So this is from the group that is the non-Turkish and or non-Muslim associates and friends of Hizmet. And so I just fell upon number 18 in that group. His name is Leonard Petlach. I was born in the Soviet Union in Minsk in 1971. In 1986, we moved to New York, to Brooklyn. I went to college and graduate school and back to graduate school again. I am the executive director of the Kings Bay YMYWHA in Brooklyn. So that is an organization that started out giving a location for sports. And then most of these Ys now have social events and cultural events and so on and so forth. The YMCA, which was the original such organization, the letters stand for the Young Man's Christian Association. So it was designed specifically and only for Christian males. Then there developed a YWCA, Christian women. And at the time, if you weren't Christian, you couldn't join. So there developed a YMHA, Young Man's and Young Woman's Hebrew Association, by the Jewish community, seeking to create a parallel kind of organization in which Jewish kids and adults could involve themselves. So he's the director, the executive director of such an entity. So he's a Jew from the former Soviet Union. I think that the first time I got acquainted with the Hizmet movement was in the context of the flotilla incident in 2010. If you are familiar with Middle Eastern history and the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, you may recall that in May of 2010, there were 6 ships that were filled with pro-Palestinian activists and humanitarians coming from Turkey, who were headed to break through the blockade on Gaza that had been imposed by the Israeli state, and that the Israeli military conducted an operation on the Mavi Marmara ship, and eventually 10 passengers were killed in that confrontation. And one of the interesting things that took place in the context of that was the range of different kinds of responses from within the Arabo-Islamic world. Right after, Gulen was one of the people who said the Israelis were in their rights in defending their territorial waters, He refused to jump onto an anti-Israel bandwagon. And what was interesting is Erdogan did exactly the opposite. And it turns out that Erdogan was behind the flotilla. He did not acknowledge it. But 6 months later, it emerged that he was behind it, intending to create an incident that would improve the possibilities for further animosity between Turkey and Israel. And that would, of course, have put him at odds with Gulen. So that's the incident that he's referring to, this guy, Leonard Petlach. Right after that, they started their first Turkish cultural center in our neighborhood. And that's when I was introduced to them by one of my elected officials, an assemblyman from Brooklyn. I've read pretty much everything available now in English on Hizmet and Fethullah Gulen, and I've become very close friends with some of the Hizmet people. I've traveled to Turkey a number of times with them. This is when that was still possible. I've brought twice, I think, some leaders of the Hizmet movement to Israel, which was really one of the most unusual experiences because a lot of Israelis would not really expect a group of Muslims, religious Muslims, to travel through Israel learning and meeting with people. So that was really an incredible experience. and I'm really privileged to be part of a group of non-Muslim members of the Hizmet movement. I think there are a lot of things that initially attracted me to the philosophy of Fethullah Gulen. It's all we know, the philosophy of love, and essentially a message of tolerance and a message of inquiry about non-Muslim communities. So it's really that emphasis on education and equality for women, and a lot of these things that are not what many people who do not know Islam automatically associate with religious Islam. And then he goes on, but it's kind of exemplary of the different unexpected directions from which I encountered individuals who had experience with Hizmet and who had a lot to say about Gulen and Hizmet. Let me just read you from one more. This is George Donikian from the same group of non-Muslims, non-Turks. This is an important, for you journalists in the group, media presence in Australia. I'm from Donikian Media. In essence, I've been a supporter of the Australian Intercultural Society for the better part of the last half dozen years. This is where I first discovered the influence of Hizmet. And for me, I understood very clearly, very early on, that it was a marvelous initiative sourced originally out of Turkey by a man called Hoj Effendi, Fethullah Gulen. In essence, what Gulen was asking, not so much his disciples, but his supporters to do, was to reach out, not his disciples, but his supporters, to reach out, travel the world, and educate as many people as possible, so that those one-time dark spots would have less room to grow. We've seen a world that's been polluted at many levels, and one of the great ways to give people a chance to understand what is happening is to educate them. And by allowing schools and universities to reach out and teach many more people than they would have, we're giving the world and all these people, all those people who live in it, a greater chance to live their lives and do it in a manner that is comforting. I saw instances in Turkey, I saw instances in Romania when we were there recently, where students were being given a license to learn and they were excited by the prospect. I saw campuses filled with inquisitive young minds, and so on and so forth. And he goes on to talk about his father. My father, who had just passed away a year before I interviewed George Donikian, my father left Europe at the end of World War II and came to the other end of the globe, where few spoke his language, much less understood his culture. He spoke several languages, but in essence, when he arrived to Australia, he was Greek, Armenian, Turk. His Turkish, as Ahmed, who was my Hizmet guide who was with me, bringing me from place to place when I spoke to these people, his Turkish was very good. We lost him a couple of years ago. My dad was someone who believed that if you aspire and you want to give your best and you keep driving yourself in that direction, then ultimately you will keep the goals and reach the marks that you set for yourself. He was delighted when I said I wanted to support this group of guys who were involved in this thing called Hizmet. He said, tell me about it. And I told him about Hizmet and Hoj Effendi. My father said, if you want to support them, get behind them. Don't do it half-heartedly. Do it to the best of your ability. And when he first met the boys from Sydney College, he was immersed in a trice and reached back and started speaking the Turkish. I remember he used to speak a great many with a great many of his good close friends in the early days in Sydney. And they could not believe that a man of Greek Armenian background could be so open to them. I said, because he is not just Armenian, not just Greek, but he's Turkish too. So of course, the two national ethnic groups with which Turkey has been most at odds over the last 200 years are the Armenians and the Greeks. And it's symptomatic of Hizmet that that just doesn't even figure into how they deal with each other. And that's clearly what impressed George Donikian and George Donikian's father, who came from both Greek and Armenian roots. But during the Ottoman period in which he was born, the area where he lived was under Ottoman Turkish control, which is why he also spoke Turkish. But his sense of camaraderie as opposed to hostility was reflective of the experience he was having with the Hizmet people he met. So that's it. I mean, that's in a nutshell. Obviously, I can go on and on and on. I can talk more or I can read more, but I think it might be more fruitful to open things up to whatever questions you might have and let me address them. than my preempting your questions by presuming to pre-address what I don't know are your questions. So, are there any questions then? The floor has been shifted. The floor is yours. And Mohammed Osama, you know, you're the one I can actually, you're right up front. I don't know how Zoom works, but yours is the face I'm seeing. I'm seeing a few others on the side. So you're stuck with the responsibility of not just smiling, you got a great smile, but of perhaps asking a question. And then we're going to go to Reshmi because she's already raised her hand.
Okay. Professor, my question is that I listened to your very carefully, and I got to, and I have a question that if Fethullah Gulen is not like a normal politician who wants to be in forefront, who wants to lead, who wants to enjoy the sweetness of the politics power, then why there is a rift between Erdogan and Fethullah Gulen? If Fethullah Gulen supported Erdogan initially,
yes,
and then Fethullah Gulen is not having the same track as the Erdogan, then
yes.
I believe that why Fethullah Gulen is become so intolerant
Yes.
for Erdogan.
Thank you. It's an excellent question. And by the way, my first appendix in the book is, why does Erdogan hate Fethullah Gulen so much?
Yeah.
So I have a three-part answer to your question. The first part is not in this appendix. It's a more general statement. If you look around the world, past and present, at autocratic individuals, so you look at someone not just like Erdogan, you look at someone like Putin, you look at someone like Donald Trump, you look at someone like, what's his name, the head of Hungary, I'm blanking on his name, Erdogan, Bolsonaro in Brazil. You have at the moment, alas, in human history, a whole range of these kinds of characters. Anyone either whom they fear has a voice that disagrees with them, or anyone whom they fear is popular enough, even without trying to compete with them, is perceived as a competitor for them. It's just the way people with that kind of ego respond. That's a general statement. But where Erdogan in particular is concerned, I had my own thoughts about that. And then when I last actually did have a conversation with Gulen, I asked him, I said, why does Erdogan hate you so much?
Yeah.
So my view, so that's part one of my answer, was Erdogan has made a pretense. You know, earlier I commented on, I've known many people who are falsely humble in my life. I've also known people who are falsely pious. There are all kinds of people who claim to be, oh, they're so religious and they're complete hypocrites, right?
Yeah.
Erdogan is cut of that sort of cloth. He has come, he pushed himself forward in Turkey as a pious Muslim who was going to ramp back seriously the excessive secularism that had begun with Ataturk, right? I believe that, that there are two big mistakes that Ataturk made. There are good things he did for Turkey, but the two big mistakes were, one, his pushing of secularism was so intense that to express your religion became a virtual crime. A woman walking with a headscarf on the street was not allowed to be walking on the headscarf with the street. It's like the opposite of what's happening in Iran today, right? So, and the second, of course, was Ataturk. Initially, he tried to draw the Kurds in to become part of allies with him. But once he'd established himself, Turkey is for Turks. And the Kurds suddenly became pushed to the edge. In fact, they didn't call them Kurds, as you may know. They were called Mountain Turks, to deny their ethnicity, to deny their languages, to deny their culture. So against that backdrop, Erdogan was saying regarding the secularism, I'm going to bring Islam back to the forefront. And he presented himself as a very pious Muslim. Shirk is one of the tertiary forms of what you're not supposed to be as a Muslim. And shirk is when you are ostentatious about presenting yourself as a Muslim. And that's what Erdogan was. I'm praying in public because I want everyone to see how pious I am. But everything about his actions contradicts the piety of Islam. So my view is he sees Gulen, who is genuinely pious, who is all the things that he, Erdogan, pretends to be and is not. And it offends him tremendously. And Gulen has many, many followers. There are people aware of him, people who respect him. And it just irritates him. If I can make an analogy to the United States, the bête noire, the bad guy for Mr. Trump from before he became president to now when he's no longer president is Barack Obama. Anything that's, Obama did this, Obama did that. Because Obama was popular. He was the antithesis in so many ways of what Trump is that it drives Trump crazy. So I see Erdogan as seeing Gulen in that kind of a light. He's like, he's just, everywhere I look, that Gulen guy is there in my face, you know? It's almost like the looking in the mirror. And, you know, there was this wonderful novella by Oscar Wilde, The Picture of Dorian Gray, where the picture continues to age and Dorian does not. And he's become more and more morally evil, and it's reflected in the picture. And finally, at the end of the novella, he can't take it anymore. He's afraid that someone's going to find the picture he's got in the attic. So he takes a knife and he slashes the picture. And of course, it ends up killing him. So I see Erdogan is looking at Gulen, and he sees this calm, peaceful, generous, humble, pious, all the things he would like to pretend to have people think he is and he's not. But then when I asked Gulen, he said, well, back when we were still in contact, when Erdogan was just getting his start politically, he was going to some meeting. And because of my web of associates, I knew that it was a setup that was going to embarrass him. And it was designed to put him in a negative position vis-a-vis where he was trying to go politically. So I called him and I warned him. I said, don't go to this meeting. And I gave him the reasons. And I believe, Gulen said, that Erdogan is worried that I will reveal that at some point, which I never would. He didn't reveal it to me. He just told me generally what it was. He did not tell me what the specifics were. But of course, Erdogan is also that kind of an individual who judges everybody by himself. He's a solipsist. So he knows darn well that if the conditions were reversed and he had something on someone, Gulen or anyone else, a political opponent for sure, he'd use it. So he assumes that Gulen is the same and would do the same, which Gulen would not. So those seem to be specific reasons. That event, whatever it was, which apparently was fairly significant, and Erdogan's fears about the outcome. And if I'm correct, my view of how Gulen offers such a mirror to his own ugliness, that he can't take it. And as I say, I add to that a more generic statement about people with those kinds of egos and how they just get obsessed about individuals whom they see as somehow in the way. You know, mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all in that fairy tale, right? And the wicked queen expects the mirror to respond because it usually does. You are. And then one day the mirror says, oh no, it's Snow White who's living out in the woods. She is determined to kill Snow White because she wants to be the fairest woman in the land. And as long as Snow White is alive, she can't be. As long as Gulen is around, somehow Erdogan feels in his gut that he can't really feel safe in the position he's established for himself. It's not rational, but then let's remember that humans are not always rational. So that's my long-winded answer, and I don't know if it's the answer.
Yeah. I got it. I got your point.
Thank you. Reshmi, you are next, if you will. And then you, Safali, you're after Reshmi.
Hi, Professor.
Hi.
I just wanted to ask, it's great to listen to you and with the direction that you were taking us through and understanding the relationship, in making us understand rather the possibility of an equation between someone who is non-dialogic and someone who is always dialogic. And in that context, I just wanted to ask that how would an atheist read the
Excellent
text
question.
that you have shared and a lecture that I would attend? Because it revolves around
absolutely
the the civil side of religion
Yes.
and the
So let me,
practicing side of religion.
yes,
This
absolutely. Absolutely.
This is question one, and just an additional question with regard to when you were citing an example for the family where this the child becomes an observant Muslim, and how do you differentiate the term practicing Muslim as against an observant Muslim? Are they the same terminology or they are different?
Okay.
Observant Muslim as against
And
a practicing Muslim.
Practicing Muslim. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll do the first question first and the second question second. And the first question is actually easy to answer, believe it or not, because there's a comment that Gulen once made. Oh, this is about 5 years ago. I don't remember even the context, but he said, well, you know, atheists who are working to improve the world are also doing God's work. They just don't know it. So his view is, his vision of Turkey and his vision of humanity, which is kind of the same vision. And by the way, it didn't start out that way. His initial impulse was to save Turkey. And he saw Turkey, this is in the 60s and 70s. If you have read, because you're all too young to remember, but I'm not, that period of time, it was a period when a lot of things were moving forward in many ways. But at the same time, there were a lot of kids who were kind of lost, particularly kids who came from families of whatever religious faith tradition, where their parents, you know, in some semi-formal sense, they went to mosque, they went to synagogue, they went to church, they went to the temple, you know, they went to the Gurdwara, you know, with some degree of frequency, non-frequency, but they didn't live their lives in any particular way that would reflect religiosity. And often those religious constructs to the kids felt confining and fake. And so they're kind of lost. And Gulen felt that about Turkish youth, that in the secular environment that had been promoted and created by Ataturk and continued generation by generation after Ataturk's death, that Turkish youth was adrift. So he began to go into coffee shops and he'd start getting into conversations. And then someone would overhear and start listening in, and someone else would. So suddenly he's got an audience of 12, 15, 18 people in this coffee shop. And meanwhile, you understand he is an imam. So the odd thing about the secular Turkish state is that it did have a department of religion, essentially. So if I want to become an imam, I have to get trained and approved by the Department of Religion. So they weren't wiping out the mosques. They were just, to a certain extent, making them less relevant. But Gulen, very charismatic, very eloquent, very perceptive, shifts from the coffee shop to the sermons he's giving on in Friday Juma services, right? Friday noon services in the mosque. And suddenly there are young people, because they've heard him or heard about him in the coffee shop, are starting to come to the mosque to hear him. And suddenly it's growing and growing and growing. And then someone says, why don't we tape this stuff? So now they've got his tapes that are going around. So his reputation is spreading further and further, but his focus is really on saving Turkey and Turkish youth. At a certain point, and I would say by the end of the 80s, there's a transition that occurs in his own thinking. And he starts to realize, you know, it's not just about Turkey and it's not just about Muslims. It's really about, we're all in it together. Planet Earth is something that involves all of us. And if something is happening in one part of the planet, it affects people in other parts. So it's really got to be bigger than that. And that's when he becomes increasingly universalistic in his thinking. He's a dyed-in-the-wool Muslim. He's a pious Muslim, but he's also thinking in broader terms, and he wants everybody to be involved, and he wants everybody to be engaged. And that's where his whole idea of dialogue, and one of the people who inspires him, because his range of reading is extraordinary. By the way, his formal education was through the end of elementary school. That's it. He is self-taught, and his reading, I mean, from physics to Greek philosophy, and everything you can imagine in between. So he's inspired in part by Socrates in the Greek tradition, who engaged in conversations and dialogues with people because of his conviction that you get further if we're having a conversation, particularly if we're trying to figure out what something like truth or justice or piety or holiness or the good is. If I'm thinking about it sitting here at my desk or sitting writing or lecturing to you, it's all inside my head, and I might not perceive the errors in my thinking that you who are listening to me will perceive. And when you speak, I will perceive errors in your thinking that you might not perceive. And so a dialogue enriches exponentially the possibility of getting to the issues. So dialogue and inclusionary dialogue becomes his ambition by the end of the 80s and has continued to flourish ever since. And his vision of an ideal Turkey, like really his vision of the world, is one in which everybody is included because everyone has something to contribute. And anyone who can be induced to be part of the process of service of Hizmet, who can be a little bit more altruistic, a little bit less selfish, is someone he wants engaged and involved in this. And he doesn't care whether you're a Jew, a Hindu, a Muslim, a Christian, whether you're Sunni or Shi'i, whether you're an Alewi or some other form of Muslim. And he doesn't care whether you're an atheist or an agnostic, because if you're interested in humanity, then you're interested in what God is interested in as he understands it. And you don't have to understand it that way, because part of his universalist perspective is his piety. How can I claim to love God if I don't love humanity when God loves all of humanity? Because guess what? God made all of humanity. God didn't just make me or my culture or my country or my religion. God made all of us. So in order to be true to my sense of loving God, I've got to love humanity. And that includes those who don't even believe there's God. I don't care. What I care about is what they're engaged in. So that's my answer to your first question. To my second, practicing and observant, I probably use those terms interchangeably. But you could make distinctions, and the obvious distinction is how observant, how practicing. What do I mean by practicing? Well, I pray 5 times a day, but you know what? I can't fast Ramadan. It's just too much trouble. Or I don't pray 5 times a day, but when it comes to Ramadan, I fast sunrise to sunset. And you don't start until you can't distinguish whether the string that's hanging above you is white or red because of the change in the light, right? So I'm really very, very careful about that. I have my app on my cell phone. I know exactly when the day is ended, and now I can start my iftar. But I don't pray during the year 5 times a day. It's just I'm too busy. I don't have time. And there's a certain flexibility in that. I can squeeze 2 prayers into one, for example. If I'm traveling, there are all kinds of ways in which you can widgie that a little bit. But I would imagine different people's sense of what it really means to be observant or what it means to be practicing differ. By the way, my Albanian friend who became a member of Hizmet, who I, as far as I know, we haven't talked in a while, prays 5 times a day, would consider himself pious. Oh, okay, I pray 5 times a day, but I don't mind eating pork. I don't eat pork, but I don't pray. Obviously ranges of things. He's married to a Christian woman. I forget how they met. She's from Austria. She's Catholic. I assume they now have 3 kids. I think they're bringing them up Muslim. I'm not sure, but she didn't convert. So there's no contradiction in his life between being married to a non-Muslim and being a pious Muslim, because as a member of Hizmet, his understanding of what it means is to be outreaching, inclusive, and embracing is the word. One of the things that when I first got at all involved by speaking at a conference about Hizmet was that the word tolerant was being used. And I raised my hand. I said, well, I don't know what the word is in Turkish, but the word tolerant in American English, at least, means I'm up here and you're down there. and I allow you to be what you are, but if there's a kind of looking down upon you, that's the wrong word. You need something like embrace. And it turns out that the Turkish word hoşgörü, if you're not aware of it, means to see the world, to see with someone else's eyes. So it is it's tolerant is a bad translation of hoşgörü. But anyway, so I think of my friend, he's obviously not just tolerant, he's embracing completely. Anyway, that's my answer to your second question. Okay.
Thank you,
And
Professor.
you are more than welcome. And Yusuf Ali, you are next, and then Mohammed, you are next.
Thank you, Professor, for such a wonderful lecture on the movement and the intellectual tradition of Hizmet. So my question is that how do you locate or where do you locate Hizmet movement in the larger tradition of Muslim or Islamic movements which happened across from many other movements before Hizmet also happened? And the second question is around can we see it as a Hizmet movement, as a faith-based civil society movement, as a result of Islam's interaction with nation state? Like in the larger tradition of, if you looking back to the history of the intellectual evolution of Judaism or Christianity, also we can see similar reformist movement happening from 16th century onwards.
Yes.
So is there some intellectual like tracing back to the Hizmet movement and other similar movements happened within the Christianity and Judaism, how we can understand in a larger Abrahamic faith context and evolution of the intellectual tradition? And second question is that how can Hizmet contribute to the non-Turkic societies? Like if the movement is if it propagates the idea of time, it has to go beyond the particular confined region. So how can how it can contribute to the non-Turkic societies in context of South Asia and other societies? Thank you.
Okay, so I think I'll answer those questions in reverse. As I mentioned at one point, Hizmet members of the Hizmet movement and institutions that have been established by Hizmet people are found in somewhere between 170 and 180 countries. So in a way, Hizmet is already answering that second question by establishing itself in so many different countries where there is a perceived need, and the need usually comes in one of two flavors. One, for sure, is education. So the establishment of schools. And you have schools in Africa, Asia, Europe, the United States that are founded and run and organized by Hizmet people of the sort that I described, that provide broad curricula whose point and purpose essentially is to raise the next generation as an educated generation, because of the conviction that Gulen has that education is a key to the improvement in the condition of the world. Because the more educated people there are, the greater likelihood there is of dialogue, of peaceful coexistence, even of embrace, that the most important human quality that militates against dialogue and embrace is ignorance. Because I don't know who you are, I don't know anything about you. That not only means because of the way we humans work, I'm likely to be a little bit afraid, because we tend to be afraid of what we don't know or don't understand. And I don't know anything about you, so someone says something about you, and I immediately think, oh, all right, I'm going to stay away from this guy, because I just heard that, because I don't know anything about you. So if we take that kind of personal situation and expand it to group situations, that's what education is about. Let me give you a concrete example from my own experience. In the 1990s, I ran a small Jewish museum here in Washington, D.C. And the star of the education program that I created was a program on stereotyping and prejudice. And I sent out the museum educator. We were small, but we boxed above our weight. out into every public and private school in the Washington, D.C. area. It's small enough so we could do that, all of them, to, I think it was the 7th grade. And she would divide the class into 4 parts. And she would say, each of you are assigned to come up with stereotypes about the following 4 groups. One group is going to be European Americans, one's going to be Asian Americans, one's going to be Latino Americans, one's going to be African Americans. And they'd take whatever amount of time to do that. And then she'd sort of have this big whiteboard and she'd start listing the various stereotypes that they came up with. And someone from group A would say, well, wait, we're not like that, because someone from a different group had come up with that stereotype. But the person who came up with that stereotype, then when it came to his group, said, wait, we're not like that. So in a very kind of active way, these kids were suddenly seeing that they had various preconceptions and misconceptions and stereotypical ideas about each other's racial, ethnic, religious, whatever groups, which they had never had an opportunity to question. And now they're questioning them. Now they're being educated about that. And that's just a little thing. If you now expand that and you're talking about a whole education program that goes from the arts to sports, from science to math to literature to language, that's what the Gulen-esque goal for humanity is, that there be schools all over the place. One of the things that Erdogan did when he started to suppress the Hizmet movement in Turkey was to close down the Hizmet schools. And he's continued to try to close down Hizmet schools in countries where he has influence, either because he can offer funds or because he can offer political or military pressure of some sort, because what he wants is an uneducated, ignorant population that is more likely to be the base that accepts whatever he says as gospel. And I live in a country, mind you, that has an enormous population that is undereducated and accepts everything that Donald Trump says as if it's gospel. His base is largely made up of people who don't ask questions, who don't wonder about anything outside their very narrow scope of influence. So Hizmet can be and is useful all across the globe in providing education programs, but also other kinds of things, like the well that was dug in that African country, thanks to the help of that Hizmet group in Australia. Those kinds of projects, and social projects, socially interactive projects, dialogue, dinners. You know, people are more likely to become more relaxed over food. You know that. It's just a standard of how we humans operate. So instead of some formal, I'm inviting you to a meeting, I'm inviting you to dinner, I'm inviting you to lunch, and we have a very different kind of conversation than we would have in my office. So that's sort of my answer to your second question. Your first question is a more complex one, but I'll try and be simple about it. And I will say 3 things, I think. Thing 1, religion is always about 2 things. It's about the revelation that is presumed by the believer to have come directly from the divine source, and then about the interpretation of the revelation. Because once Moses is gone, once Muhammad is gone, whatever they have left behind as a series of prescriptions that are presumed to come from God, we're left interpreting. What does it mean when God says, thou shalt not commit murder? What does it mean to commit murder? If I swat a mosquito, did I just commit murder? Or is that a form of killing, but it's not murder, because murder is something else? What does it mean not to bear false witness against my neighbor? What does it mean, in a more esoteric phrase in the middle of the Bible, not to seethe, to boil a kid, as in a small calf, in its mother's milk? What does that mean? Why does that end up meaning gastronomically, if I'm a very traditional Jew, that I don't have milk and meat at the same meal? In fact, I don't even have milk and meat products within 6 hours of each other. Why does that mean that? Because that's how it has come to be interpreted over the course of time. So that said, second part of my answer, I can trace the idea of a universalist kind of tolerance all the way back to the Quran. I can also find passages in the Quran, if I look for them, that will encourage me in the other direction. Because what I'm dealing with is a revelation that appears over the course of 22 years to this dude Muhammad between 610 and 632, that his followers hear, it gets written down and organized as the Quran another 22, 23 years later by Uthman in 654, 655. And first of all, we're assuming that Uthman got it all right, because if we're believers, we simply accept that. But more to the point, once we're beyond that point, we have now entered the whole territory of the next 1400 years of how to interpret the Quran. And surprise, from the get-go, we do not have unity. It's not just that from the get-go, we have, after the Prophet's death, we have the question of whether we should be following Abu Bakr or Ali as the Khalifa who's to succeed him. It's beyond that kind of a division to the notion of the path, right? Sharia. And how many schools of Sharia are there? 4 major schools in the Sunni tradition, 3 in the Shia tradition, and many more subset schools, each of which is characterized by the particular ways in which it interprets the same text, the Quran, and I might add, some of the same text, the Hadith, except not everybody. There are some Hadiths everyone agrees on, there are some that they don't, but let's just stick with the Quran. So how I understand the Quran as my source for everything is in part a question of how I understand. So there is a chain with links that leads directly from the text of the Quran to Gulen in terms of the Muslim history of potential to embrace, to be universal, which leads me to my third comment. Islam, like Christianity, Islam spread, but even more, much more rapidly than did Christianity, so that within 80 years of the death of the Prophet Muhammad, Islam extended from the west coast of the Iberian Peninsula to the eastern part of South Asia. And of course, eventually further east, beyond Asia, right, into Indonesia, Malaysia, and all the way halfway across the Pacific. So in the course of such a widespread, over many centuries, it stands to reason that in different parts of that world, you're going to have different kinds of leaders, different kinds of communities informed by different cultural sensibilities. So I'm an Arab Muslim, no, I'm a Turkish Muslim, no, I'm an Indonesian Muslim, no, I'm an Indian Muslim, which means that my sense of Islam is in part going to be affected by what I am in terms of my ethnicity, my culture, just as one finds that for Christianity, just as one finds that in a different way for Judaism, which spread as a series of islands in these large seas that were Muslim or Christian or Hindu or what have you. So there are going to be different kinds of rulers, there are going to be different kinds of communities, and therefore there are going to be different kinds of attitudes, both to what it means to be a proper Muslim and what it means to engage with non-Muslims in a negative or a positive way. So Gulen is his own sui generis, he's his own thing. He's got predecessors all the way back to the Quran, all the way forward to Sayyid Nursi, but he has opened things up, and I think your analogy is correct, in a reformationist way that, what's the word I want, breathes an extensive new breath into that whole, the whole concept of Islam as embracing, Islam as tolerant, Islam as inclusive, Islam as civil. He is unique, but he draws from a long heritage to which he also brings what he brings from other heritages with which he's familiar through his vast reading, if that answers the first question. Great. Okay, Muhammad Alamullah, you are the next.
Yes, okay. Thank you, sir. Your lecture was really very insightful and informative. Sir, my question is, like you said earlier, that the coup in Turkey in 2016 was a staged program, just as some Jews in Germany did by seeing themselves on fire to blame the communists.
Not the Jews, the Nazis. It was not the Jews, it was
Okay.
the Nazis, it was Hitler's party who set the
Okay,
Reichstag
Nazis.
on
Okay,
fire.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, sorry. So
It's okay.
similar things people said about 9/11, that some elements staged it. So is there a possibility of such measures even in this advanced stage? And also my question is, then what are the motives of such peoples behind such actions? If so, why are the details not made public? And shouldn't the lies be exposed now that the technology has advanced enough to reveal the details of such dramas? Is it a difficult task?
Okay, good
Hello,
question.
sir?
Yes, excellent question. In the matter of the Reichstag, of course, Hitler wants it to be understood that it's the communists who burned it so he can get rid of them. And he is in growing and ultimately sufficient control, and that's the important thing, of the media, that he can promote that lie, and no one is in a position to publicly contradict him, or at least on a loud enough level that enough people are aware of it. And I should add, in Germany, he's already becoming a very, very popular figure. And outside Germany, he is thought of as a kind of joke. No one takes him seriously. They think of him as a buffoon. So no one is even really bothering to make the effort to contradict the lie. Fast forward to 2016, and then I'll backtrack to 9/11. 2016, the same is true on an even more stringent level with Erdogan. He controls all of the media by that point. This is why he's imprisoning journalists at such a high rate, because he doesn't want anyone who can contradict him. And again, what's happening in the outside world? I gave the example of that New Yorker journalist. This is an American journalist who is well respected, who for whatever reasons, whether it was laziness or ignorance, or I don't know, maybe he himself had heard things and was hostile to Gulen or favored Erdogan, I don't know. But you have him as an example reporting a long article on Gulen in which all of his sources are clearly from the Erdogan-controlled media, nothing that said anything else. So you have people like myself who look at that situation and say, how can you not see that this is a fake coup, but who are not interested or not aware, or who are not interested in being aware? So yes, we should expose these lies. Yes, there's sufficient evidence and technology to do so. Now we come back to 9/11. Clearly in the United States, there is no one at the time in a position of leadership who is going to be interested in even suggesting that the narrative that we understand, 18 Saudis in the employ, as it were, of Osama bin Laden, got hold of those planes, drove them into the Twin Towers. There was the third that was heading for Washington, D.C., but was taken down in the field in Pennsylvania. And there was the fourth, remember, that actually headed into the Pentagon in Washington. That all of that was strictly masterminded, operated, and affected by Osama bin Laden. That's a nice, simple, straightforward narrative. Well, it's interesting. It turns out two things, that our airports, of course, were immediately closed, except there were a few planes were allowed to leave. And what were those planes? They were planes taking Saudi nationals back to Saudi Arabia. And those nationals were at the airport practically before these events took place, which means there was advanced warning, which means someone more than just Osama bin Laden, which means maybe the Saudis themselves, although Osama was hostile to the Saudi government, after all, he was a Saudi, his wealth was based on being part of that extended family that ruled, but he was yet hostile to the government, based, by the way, on his interpretation of Islam and his feeling that they weren't living up to being proper Muslim rulers. But it sounds awfully odd that everything happened from that one source without some sort of a collaborative effort from the Saudis. Then let me add another thing. Who was president at that time? The member of a family, the Bush family, that had very strong connections with the Saudis by way of its own wealth that it had gained through oil that was through Saudi connections. Not Iranian oil, not Iraqi oil, Saudi oil. And Bush's presidency up to that point, because he had been president for about a year, and he became president, as it were, by default, as people are also aware. This is a crisis in this country, even more so now, the question of the Supreme Court and how, in effect, they handed the presidency to Bush over Al Gore. When he hears about this, the Twin Towers incident, you see video footage of him. He's actually he has visited some classroom, some elementary school, and he has a look in his face of complete, like a deer in the headlights, blank. It's like he doesn't know what to say. It's like he's lost. 9/11 galvanizes his presidency. It gives his presidency something to focus on. Now we can find something to do. And what they find to do, of course, is to mount an attack that takes them 6 months to carefully plan of Afghanistan. And then, more importantly, we've taken out the Taliban, and mission accomplished, which of course it was not. And what do? By 2003, they switch gears and they head into Iraq in what, as anyone with half a brain understands, was a complete debacle. It had no logic of any sort. It only had one logic. It gives a galvanized, everyone support me now, support this presidency, support this government, because we're protecting the world from evil people. And now we have the coinage, right? What's the phrase that he uses? The axis of evil. So we have different countries which are now part of the axis of evil. So the 9/11 becomes an extraordinary instrument for saving the Bush presidency and buying him actually the rest of his term, and by the skin of his teeth, a second term. And that has transformed America, and not for the good. So the answer to your question is, should whatever really happened at 9/11 be exposed? You bet it should. But in whose interest is it that it not be exposed? Erdogan doesn't want us to understand that he engineered the coup. Hitler did not want people to understand that he engineered the burning of the Reichstag. And certainly the Republican leadership in this country are not interested in someone revisiting 9/11 with any narrative except the martyrs who perished and the evil Osama, whom we finally got, although the Republicans don't like the fact that it was under Obama's administration that Osama bin Laden was killed, because somehow that would give him credit for something. And so it's not in their interest for you and me to know or to promote the truth. And alas, I guess that's as old as history. So those who have the power to promote their own position will do so to the extent that they can. And if that happens to do something small like contradict the actual truth, small price to pay to keep me in power. So that's my very honest and cynical response to your very excellent, I guess it wasn't a cynical question, it was just a real question.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions? Reshmi, is that a thumbs up? That's a thumbs up. That's not a question. Okay.
Reshmi had picked up her, had raised her hand. Reshmi, do you still want to ask another question?
No, that was a thumbs up raise. That time was a thumbs up, I think.
No, these are thumbs up for the answers that you're giving. I mean, you answered for the questions that were asked by other participants. I have so many questions because, going through the texts or even the snippets of the texts from Quran and trying to read through them from an absolutely objective perspective is very difficult. It makes me extremely uncomfortable.
And understand that every religious text should provoke the same response. If you read the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, if you read the Gospels, a God of love, he curses the tree. Wait, the Bhagavad Gita. right? You know, Krishna is telling Arjuna, you've got to do this for the following reasons, but still, it's hard for us to say, why are you encouraging war? But he's encouraging war to restore the Dharma, right? To restore the order of things. So there's a logic to it, but at the same time, it could make you uncomfortable. So it's not just the Quran. That's my point. I'm not defending the Quran. I'm saying all religious revelation
all religious
has this
texts.
problem. Yeah.
Yeah. So in that same context, when we talk about dialogue through service, you know, and then service is associated with religion.
Yes.
An altruistic service and then so how do we really contextualize service in the neoliberal era, the market that we are in, you know, this whole capitalist that we are there, and you as a scholar, you know, your relevance as a scholar and our relevance as learners, you know.
Yes. So
how do you see the dynamic?
Yeah. So Rishmi, there's one thing, and the only thing I can say about that. I teach at a school, Georgetown University, which has loads of students who from around the world, not just the United States, but are from what we call the 1%, right? They were born not with silver spoons in their mouths, with golden spoons in their mouths. I mean, I had a kid who was going to be back late from Greece, who was going to be back late after midterm break because he was helping his father's prime minister campaign. I had a kid. Actually, it was a course on Jewish mysticism, and his name was Hussein. He was Muslim, Arab, but Hussein is a very common name, right? It's like in English, Smith is a common name. And he did very well in the course. And I ran into him later, and I had just been in Jordan for this conference of Palestinian and Israeli women, in which I was a ringer. They had like 2 men and 205 women, and I was one of the men. And I said, oh, I was just in your country. And we chatted for a few minutes. And then as we started to part, he said, Professor, you know, if you ever go back to my country, please let me know, because, well, my uncle's the king, right? And I have American students who come from those kinds of strata as well. They take courses with me in which softly, but emphatically, I pound these kinds of messages home again and again and again and again. And I don't think I can do more than that. You can't force anyone to be what they're not. You just hope that some of it rubs off, that some of the people who have those kinds of resources come to understand how good it would be to use those resources to help others rather than to accumulate more booty for themselves or themselves and their family. And yes, we live in a particularly disturbing era, and I can in particular speak, of course, about the United States. That's where I live. And we just survived 4 years of the most spectacular example of a sociopathic, psychopathic, egotistical, it's all about me person, you know, on the planet. And we survived him, and those who follow him include all of these people who are poor and somehow think that he cares about them when he does not. I can't do anything about that. All I can do is, as far wherever I am lecturing, whatever I write, and I don't know who reads my stuff, talk about this stuff, you know? And the more of us here there are who are doing that, the more hope there is. And that's what Gulen's whole thing is. The more his medi I create, the better chance there is for the world to become a better place. And it is the world that he is worried about, as I said. So that's my sort of non-answer answer, you know? We just have to keep trying, keep doing it, not give up. And, you know, recognize that we won't convince everyone, recognize that there are always going to be Trump-like people, Modi, same cut from the same cloth, Bolsonaro. I mean, there's a list right now. It's terrifying. And I am reminded of the 1930s. But in the 1930s, as I say to my friends, the big difference was the United States was kind of this light on the hill. And now the United States is in the same camp, or at least was for 4 years, and is in danger of, in another week, moving back in that direction because of our midterm elections. So we just have to keep trying.
Thank you, Dr.
Sure.
Professor Soltes. Does anyone else have any questions? Akanksha, Shruti, Kulsum, Irfan, Ruben, Mohammad Afnan, James, Noor, Imran, Haver, Mona Lisa, Imam Hussain, anybody?
She's calling them out by calling all the names.
Not exactly. Actually, I had some questions, but you already answered, with some of the questions that were related. So it's answered.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prajapati. Ankasha Prajapati. Love it. Great names. Shruti.
Yes, thank you for such an enlightening session. I guess my question would be more about how, like you mentioned, the sort of world we're living in similarly is like sort of like 1930s with, the extensive reach of the far right that has been going on. So would you say like the Hizmat movement and like other sort of dialogic movements that have become increasingly prevalent is trying to somehow, like the far right narrative that has been created of, of hate and of all things sad, of prejudice, all that. So do you feel like such dialogic movements like the Hizmat movement and other movements, we're trying to sort of maybe not, well, the motive is to make a better narrative, but like sort of to neutralize the narrative that has been going on in the world?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's, of course, it's one of the reasons I feel Hizmet and movements like it, and you're right, there are many others as well, are so important so as to provide that kind of antidote, that counter narrative. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Muhammad Osama, you have another question.
Professor, I've got two small questions, and I think answer will be short too. My first question is that I fail to understand this, how Hizmat movement is managing to run all these organizations from school to colleges to hostel to with such facilities. I've known the kind of standard they give and the amount of money they receive in return is very little. Even to run a house, it's very difficult. It's a big calculation to run. Even to run a house, you need to calculate a lot from your expense to income, and how they're managing these such big organization, because they are, as you said, they're running from over 170 to 180 country, and they're not getting any support from their own country, that is Turkey. That's the first question. And the second question is even more small. The second question is that why the world is becoming a place of a very intolerant place for people who just want to live peacefully. From every country, we can see that from in India to Pakistan to Sri Lanka to Afghanistan, even United States, Iran, Israel, then Palestine. There is no place for people who just want to live peacefully. There is everyone just want to implement their views on other. And I believe there should be more space for people who just want to live peacefully, who just want to enjoy their life. Thank you.
Thank you. In answer to your first question, it is kind of miraculous. I mean, when Hizmet first began, and it was a more local affair, it was very much the personal charisma of Gulen that got things done. I'll give you a concrete example. It's in my book. He was trying to create a dormitory complex for a school to which kids could come from Eastern Anatolia. I think it was in the Izmir area when he was there still. And the problem was there were no furnishings for the students and no money to get them. And he had someone who was a kind of a supporter, and he went to him and he said, "How many bedrooms you have?" He said, "Well, we have 2 bedrooms, one for my wife and me and one for my son, but my son's off his school. He's not coming back." He said, "Good. I want all the bedroom furniture from that second room for the dorm." And the guy said, "Okay." He was able to talk people into those kinds of contributions. And then as it grew, its volume of support grew, and many of its relatively early supporters came from the business community of a upper middle class, not the 1%, not all the way up there for the most part, but people who are very comfortable living, doing very good business and in a position to be generous, and they were. So they would make contributions to the Hizmet movement, to the various projects. And as it has spread across the world, those contributors have spread. When Erdogan began to shut so many things down, a lot of their sources of support dried up, and it has been much more difficult than it had been in the past. But it's still, they manage through contributions and through a lot of the work. Most of the work is done by volunteers. You know, when I go, as I'm invited to speak, let's say in Texas or Arizona, to an event that is sponsored, usually, you know, let's say I'm speaking at an iftar dinner, a public iftar dinner. So I was speaking at one this past Ramadan in, where was it? San Antonio, I think, Texas. And it's interesting, the community already, they've been there for maybe 18 years. And at that dinner, it's a small community. It wasn't San Antonio, it was Odessa, Texas. That's it, Odessa, which is a small community. There are 120 people at a dinner in a small community, including the mayor, including the chief of police, including the fire chief. In other words, they've established these relations with public figures and with the community. So their support in terms of participation comes through them, but it's all volunteers. There's one guy who's kind of running that office, and everybody else is a volunteer, and they spend hours helping out. And that combined with contributions makes it possible to provide, you know, that kind of a very fine meal. And most of the food, by the way, it's not being catered from the outside. The families who are part of the Hizmet movement are cooking big time and bringing the food to the place where it's being held. So they have a handful of hired waiters who are serving and stuff, but the food has been made, actually, it's homemade in a very literal sense for the most part, and so on. So they manage. It is quite extraordinary, because you're right. They're not certainly getting any support from the places where they are in terms of government or what have you, nor are they getting any support from Turkey. On the contrary, they have opposition from Turkey, but there is a wide enough web of people with wherewithal to contribute who are willing to do so in excess of what they should if they're thinking of their own socioeconomic situation, but they're very generous, they are altruistic, and volunteers help make it work. What was the second question again?
My second question is that why the world has become a very
yes. Now I remember. And yes, now I know I forgot the question, because I don't have an answer. You know, why is it? Why is it? I don't know. I don't understand people like that. I don't understand why it gratifies you just to have more. You don't need it, because it makes you feel better than me, because you have more than I do. And if you can take more from me and give more to yourself, somehow that makes you feel better, because the distance between you and me is, I mean, I just don't get it. There are people like that. There have always been people like that. And it seems that there are times in history where, for whatever reason, the volume of such individuals increases, and then hopefully it reaches a point and it bursts and it decreases, which is, of course, what happened. This is what happened to the tyrants of the 1930s. They were all taken down. Hopefully that kind of scenario repeats itself worldwide now, but I don't know why. It's just how it is, and it's obviously distressing. It's very distressing.
Yeah.
Thank you, though, for your question.
Thank you.
Anyone else? All right, then I'm going to go meet with the student who is waiting to speak with me about her midterm paper that she's worrying about. So I said I'd meet with her on Zoom. So I will go do that if there are no more questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor Ori Soltes. We are so glad to have this wonderful discussion with you. I will just give some admin announcements before we end for the day. One is that the reflection forms have been sent to you, and the deadline is 48 hours. That is Friday, October 14th by 7:30. Second is that we have the previous talk of last year's talk of Professor Ori on our YouTube channel. It's called Hizmet's Philosophy of Dialogue. So if anybody is interested, they are most welcome to go and watch that as well. And the third, tomorrow we will not have a session, we will have a discussion day. So everybody needs to come prepared with some kind of a story or presentation about dialogue. I have already sent the pointers on the email. The dialogue has to be something you have seen, experienced, something you've read about in the media, and you have to give your analysis of that dialogue process and what we can learn from it, what could have been better. And so this is more, it's completely your baby, and we are happy to hear whatever your assessments are. And after that, it'll be a pure question and answer. So you will, so after everybody's given their, talks, discussions, or presentations, everybody will, the rest of you will ask each other. We'll have a question answer at the last, at the fag end of the session. And if anybody has already discussed, decided that topic, they are most welcome to send it to a group, or and I will schedule a particular order. That's all for today. Thank you so much, Professor Ori. It was such a pleasure to have you, and it's always just mind awakening to hear all the stories that you tell and everything you share. And I'm sure everybody, Reshmi had a comment about your book, and
I saw.
And she basically, it's quite popular in India as well with other people who are doing research. So I just thought I'll mention it because she mentioned it in the chat.
Wonderful.
And that's all. We wish you have a pleasant morning, and everyone else here has a pleasant evening.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you also
so much.
very much. Bye for now.